3 days had passed since August Renner was suspended from the only job he'd taken since his wife died. A security guard had escorted him out of Cypress Bend Golf and Country Club's working grounds without quite meeting his eyes. Now Gus made a decision that could clear his name, destroy what remained of his civilian life, or do both at once. He was going back onto the property that night without permission. Not because he had found proof. Because Havoc had been trying to tell him something for 6 weeks, and Gus had finally run out of ways to explain the dog away. 3 hours later, outside Cypress Bend's half-finished West Wing, Havoc would clamp his teeth into the sleeve of Gus's jacket and drag him backward hard enough to tear the stitching. The sound Gus would remember was the fabric ripping, because it marked the instant the dog stopped him from taking one more step toward a gas-filled corridor just to make his suspicion undeniable. By sunrise, investigators would be measuring a gas leak behind fresh drywall that was later determined to have been deliberately created, photographing property hidden inside the renovation itself, and asking questions that reached far beyond a stolen pistol or one country club's insurance policy. But none of that was what stayed with Gus afterward. What stayed with him was the dog pulling him back. 7 years earlier, on a road half a world away, Gus had warned that something was wrong and watched the warning disappear into a chain of command that preferred a schedule to uncertainty. Master Sergeant Eli Bragg had died on that road. Gus had spent 7 years telling himself the lesson was simple. When you know, speak louder. Havoc would teach him something harder. Knowing and fearing were not the same thing. Instinct was not proof. Silence was not caution. And sometimes the most dangerous moment was not when nobody listened to you, but when grief made you so desperate to be right that you stopped listening to anything else. 6 weeks earlier, old Gus Renner knew was that Cypress Bend's new general manager had called his dog a liability in front of 40 members, and that the dog kept stopping at the same construction fence as if something behind it mattered. Gus did not yet know what. He only knew Havoc had never shown that kind of focus without a reason. August Renner had gone by Gus for so long that most people at Cypress Bend didn't know his first name was on a Silver Star citation in a drawer he never opened. He was 43 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades carrying things other people couldn't. A close-cropped, gray beard framed a face marked by deep creases around eyes that had learned young to watch a horizon rather than a room. His hands were scarred across the knuckles in a pattern that told a story nobody at the club had ever asked him to tell. He had spent 19 years in the Army, the last 11 as a Green Beret with 3rd Special Forces Group. For 8 of those years, he worked alongside military working dogs, and Mary Ann sometimes woke him when he said their names in his sleep. There was another name she heard just as often: Master Sergeant Eli Bragg. Eli was the closest thing Gus had ever had to a younger brother by choice rather than blood, a communications specialist who had died on a road outside a compound in eastern Afghanistan 7 years earlier. Gus had warned that the route felt wrong. The warning had been logged, noted, and overruled by an officer more concerned with a timetable than a hunch Gus could not fully document. Gus did not talk about Eli. Instead, he carried a small, battered military compass Bragg had given him as a joke gift years earlier. "So you always know which way home is, Sarge, since God knows you never say much about it." The needle had been stuck at a useless angle for 4 years after a fall Gus never bothered to get repaired. He kept it in his jacket pocket the way some men carry a photograph. Havoc was the last of Gus's working dogs and the one who had stayed. When Gus separated from the Army 6 years earlier, the Army approved his adoption of his final canine partner. They had been inseparable ever since. Gus's wife, Mary Ann, had died of an aggressive cancer 18 months after he came home for good, and something in him had gone very quiet after that. Not broken exactly, but folded down small, the way a man folds a flag when there's no one left standing beside him to help hold the corners. He had a brother, Foster, who managed the grounds crew at Cypress Bend Golf and Country Club outside Cypress Bend, Louisiana. And Foster had offered him a job the month after the funeral, not out of pity exactly, but because Foster understood that his brother needed somewhere quiet to stand with his hands busy while the rest of him healed. Foster was 2 years younger and had never served himself, having stayed home to run their father's small landscaping business before it grew, over 2 decades, into a modest grounds management contract that eventually brought him to Cypress Bend full-time. The two brothers had never been especially alike. Foster was loud where Gus was quiet, quick to laugh where Gus measured every word. But grief had a way of making old differences matter less. For the first 18 months after the funeral, Foster simply made sure his brother had somewhere to be every morning that did not require him to explain himself to anyone. Cypress Bend sat on 400 acres of rolling Louisiana parkland land that had been a working plantation more than a century earlier. After several changes of ownership, nobody at the club discussed much anymore. It became one of the state's more understated old money institutions. No flashy renovations, no aggressive membership drives, just 91 years of quiet continuity that longtime members prized precisely because it never seemed to change. Derek Ashcombe's arrival and the board's newfound appetite for modernizing the member experience represented the first real disruption to that continuity in a generation, a fact that made more than a few longtime members uneasy in ways they hadn't yet found the words to articulate before Gus's suspension gave the unease a concrete shape. Gus took the groundskeeper job. He mowed fairways at dawn, raked bunkers, repaired irrigation lines, and trimmed the boxwood hedges along the clubhouse drive with the same unhurried precision he had once used to clear a room. He said little. He nodded to members who nodded to him, which was most of them, and ignored the ones who looked through him entirely, which was some of them. He lived in a small staff cottage at the edge of the property. Keeping a dog on the grounds full-time was technically against club policy, but Foster had quietly overlooked the rule for the 4.5 years Gus had worked there. Everyone who mattered at Cypress Bend had come to understand that Havoc was no more a liability than the sprinkler system, and considerably better behaved than several of the members' children. Havoc, for his part, had settled into retirement with the same disciplined patience he'd once brought to explosive detection work. He was a striking dog at 11, fawn-coated with a black mask gone silver around the muzzle. A scar crossed the fur over his left eye, a souvenir from shrapnel on one of his final deployments. The same blast had damaged his shoulder badly enough that military veterinarians recommended retirement not long afterward. Even in retirement, he still moved with an economy longtime members occasionally noticed without understanding. A working animal stillness, the readiness of a dog who had learned that panic wasted the seconds that mattered. He rode in the passenger seat of Gus's utility cart most mornings, ears flicking lazily at birdsong, watching the fairways with mild professional interest, and had, in 4.5 years at the club, never once growled at a member, snapped at a child, or so much as barked without cause. Members' children had come to consider Havoc a fixture of their summers at the club. A line of small handprints in dried mud was still faintly visible on one side of the maintenance shed from a birthday party 3 summers earlier. The birthday girl's mother had specifically requested Havoc make an appearance, and Gus still had a photograph somewhere in a drawer. The dog sitting patiently in a paper party hat he tolerated for exactly 4 minutes, before Gus, laughing despite himself, finally took it off. The club's insurance policy technically prohibited aggressive or working breed dogs on the premises. Nobody had enforced it, because nobody who actually knew Havoc considered him a risk of any kind. Gus and Marianne had married young, before either deployment had taught him what silence could do to a marriage if he let it, and she had spent 14 years teaching him, patiently and without ever once making him feel broken for needing the lesson, how to come back into a room after his mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Years earlier, Marianne had been the one who insisted he try working with a canine partner when the Army first offered him the chance. Not Havoc, the first dog. In the dry way she had of delivering the truths he needed most, she told him that a man who had stopped trusting himself to notice danger in a room might trust an animal to notice it for him instead. She had been right more often than Gus had ever fully told her. He thought about that a great deal in the 18 months after her funeral, standing in the quiet staff cottage some evenings with Havoc's head heavy against his knee, understanding slowly that the dog wasn't just a retired partner he'd been permitted to keep. He was the last living piece of a lesson Marianne had spent 14 years teaching him, still teaching it, patiently, long after she no longer could herself. Foster's wife, Denise, had taken to leaving a covered plate on the cottage porch most Sunday evenings. It was a small, unspoken kindness neither brother ever discussed directly. Gus came to measure the slow progress of his grief less by any therapist's checklist than by whether he remembered to bring the empty dish back to Foster's house before rain got to it. Some weeks he remembered, some weeks he didn't. Havoc, without fail, sat beside the dish on the porch rail every Sunday evening, regardless, patient in the particular way of an animal who had learned that some rituals mattered to a grieving man, even when the man himself had momentarily forgotten why. Over Gus's 4.5 years at Cypress Bend, a small circle of longtime members and staff had become part of his daily rhythm, even though he rarely spoke more than a few words to any of them in a given week. Priscilla Vance had chaired the Veterans Scholarship Gala Committee for 11 years running and treated hospitality as a genuine craft rather than a social obligation. She always stopped her cart to ask after Havoc by name. More than once, she quietly arranged for the kitchen to set aside a plain grilled chicken breast for him on gala evenings, an indulgence she insisted was purely for the sake of club morale and not sentiment. Colonel Adele Foundthe, retired from a military legal career and a long civilian run as a courtroom litigator, kept mostly to herself on the back nine. Gus recognized in her deliberate pace the gait of someone trained to notice details other people walk past. Otis Beauregard had managed the club's records for 34 years before easing into a part-time consulting role the board never quite let him retire from. He was the only person at Cypress Bend who called Gus by his given name, August, with an old-fashioned formality Gus had come to find comforting rather than stiff. And Leon Fontenoy had joined the grounds crew 4 years earlier after a stint in highway maintenance he complained about with theatrical regularity. He attached himself to Gus early on with the loose loyalty of a younger man who had decided, more or less on sight, that the quiet groundskeeper with the mow was someone worth having his back. Gus never fully understood the reasoning and eventually stopped questioning it. None of them knew, in any real detail, what Gus had done overseas. He had never told them, and none of them had ever pressed. Gus sometimes thought that was its own quiet form of respect. The small community of people who paid attention had simply decided, without discussion, that a man's history was his own to share or not. The steadiness he brought to the job spoke plainly enough without every detail filled in. Derek Ashcombe had been at the club for 11 days when he decided otherwise. The new general manager arrived with a business degree from a school whose name he mentioned more often than seemed necessary, a mandate from the club's board to modernize the member experience, ahead of a long-planned renovation of the clubhouse's west wing, and a clipboard he carried everywhere like a small ceremonial weapon. He toured the grounds on his third day, trailed by an assistant taking notes, and stopped short at the sight of Havoc dozing in the shade beside the maintenance shed while Gus repaired a sprinkler head 20 feet away. "Is that a club dog?" Derek asked the assistant, who did not know and said so. "It's Foster Renner's brother's dog," she offered. "He's been here for years. Never any trouble." Derek made a note. Gus, close enough to hear but not close enough to be addressed directly, kept working, and Havoc lifted his head only long enough to confirm the newcomer posed no immediate meaning to his morning before settling back into the shade. Within the week, the note became a policy memo. Citing liability and insurance concerns, it ordered all non-service animals removed from club grounds before the Veterans Scholarship Gala 6 weeks later. Gus read it on the staff bulletin board in the break room. He stood very still for a long moment, then folded the memo once and put it in his jacket pocket beside the compass. Foster found him in the equipment barn that evening, oiling a hedge trimmer with more attention than the task required. "I'll talk to the board," Foster said. "They know you. They know that dog." "Don't make it a thing," Gus said. "I'll figure something out." Foster had spent 31 years being the louder of the two Renner brothers, a role he'd settled into early and comfortably. Watching Gus work oil into the trimmer's hinge with more care than the tool needed, he recognized this particular quiet. It was not agreement so much as a closed door. It was the same stillness Gus had worn like armor in the worst months after Mary Ann's funeral, before 4.5 years of groundskeeping and one steady dog slowly coaxed something closer to peace back into him. Foster did not push further that evening. He had learned the hard way that pushing rarely worked with Gus, and that the better strategy, most of the time, was simply to stay close enough to notice when his brother needed him and say nothing until then. He drafted a resignation letter that same week, sitting at the small desk in the staff cottage with Havoc's chin resting on his knee. He got as far as, "After careful consideration, I've decided." Then he set the pen down and slid the unfinished page into the top drawer. He could not make himself write a sentence that felt less like a decision and more like a surrender. The West Wing renovation broke ground the same week. The contractor was Guardian Crest Security and Renovations, brought in on Derek's specific recommendation over two local bids the board had originally favored. Guardian Crest promised a faster timeline and a discounted rate that several longtime board members privately grumbled sounded too good to survive contact with an actual invoice. 2 days after the dog memo appeared, Derek hosted a renovation preview on the clubhouse veranda for roughly 40 members. Gus had no reason to be part of it. He was driving a utility cart toward the maintenance shed with Havoc sitting beside him when Derek stopped in the middle of a sentence and pointed with his clipboard. That, Derek said, is exactly the kind of loose end we're trying to clean up. Several heads turned. Gus slowed the cart. Derek continued in the polished tone he used when he wanted a decision to sound inevitable. Our carrier has specifically flagged working breeds as a liability exposure. By gala weekend, personal animals will not be permitted on club grounds. Priscilla Vance spoke before anyone else could. Havoc has been on these grounds for years. He's never caused a problem. I'm sure everyone is attached to him, Derek said. Liability isn't a referendum on whether a dog is nice. He's a retired military working dog, another member said. Derek glanced at Havoc, then at Gus, as if the distinction made the situation more inconvenient rather than more interesting. Then he's earned a comfortable retirement somewhere appropriate. We can't redesign an insurance policy around somebody's mutt because the staff got sentimental. The word landed harder than the rest. Havoc's ears came up at the change in the voices around him. He did not bark or growl. He simply watched. Gus had been called worse things by worse men in worse places. It had never stopped mattering. He put the cart back in gear. Priscilla watched him drive away before turning to Derek. You have been here 11 days. I know exactly how long I've been here. Then I'd think carefully before you decide 11 days is enough time to understand every person and animal who was here before you. Derek cited the insurance carrier's written guidance and assured her the policy was purely precautionary, nothing personal. Priscilla repeated those words to Adele Foundthe over coffee 2 days later, with enough irony to make clear what she thought of them. Adele did not promise to intervene. She said only that a man's instincts under minor friction usually revealed how he would behave under real pressure. Neither woman raised the issue with Gus directly. They both sensed he would rather solve it quietly himself than be turned into a cause he had never asked for. Gus paid the renovation little mind at first. Construction crews came and went at Cypress Bend the way they did at any aging property, and he had a memo about his dog to worry about, and a resignation letter he'd started drafting in the top drawer of his desk that he wasn't yet ready to finish. It was Havoc who noticed first, the way Havoc noticed most things before anyone thought to ask him to. On the third morning of construction, Gus drove the utility cart past the fenced West Wing and felt Havoc rise beside him before he saw anything unusual. The dog stepped down from the cart without being told, moved 3 paces toward the plywood barrier, and stopped. Not a formal explosives alert. Gus knew the difference too well to romanticize it. Havoc did not sit. He did not freeze on a trained indication. He simply stood with his nose lifted, drawing the air in slow, deliberate pulls, then turned his head toward a narrow seam between 2 sheets of plywood. His body had changed. That was what made Gus stop. Retired or not, Havoc still carried a vocabulary and muscle and breath that Gus understood better than most spoken language. Curiosity looked loose. Interest looked forward. Fear looked different again. This was concentration. Not enough to call evidence. Not enough even to call an alert. But enough that Gus got out of the cart. What have you got? Havoc moved closer to the barrier and inhaled again. A Guardian Crest supervisor appeared from the other side before Gus could examine the gap. Heavy-set, pale-haired, soft-spoken. His badge identified him as Roy Pruitt. Morning, Pruitt said. His tone was polite without being welcoming. Need you to keep the dog away from the active site. Something spill in there? Construction site. Everything spills eventually. Gus looked at Havoc. Pruitt smiled the way men did when they wanted a conversation to end without technically being rude. Solvents, adhesives, new insulation, fuel for the lifts. A lot of smells an animal isn't used to. That was reasonable. Gus made himself say so. Fair enough. He called Havoc back to the cart. The dog obeyed immediately, but looked over his shoulder 3 times before they rounded the bend. That evening, Gus opened the small green notebook he normally used for sprinkler measurements and wrote the date at the top of a clean page. West Wing, Havoc interest. He paused, then beneath it he wrote, possible ordinary cause, adhesives, fuel, construction chemicals. It was a habit left over from the Army. A suspicion written without its innocent explanation beside it had a way of becoming belief before a man noticed the difference. Eli Bragg had once teased him about it during a long overnight watch. You don't trust anybody, Sarge. Not even yourself. Especially not myself, Gus had answered. At the time, they had both laughed. Now Gus underlined the innocent explanation once, closed the notebook, and told himself that was the end of it. 10 days later, the antique pistol case in the clubhouse hallway was found open. Not smashed exactly. The glass had been broken, but the lock had been worked first. Gus could see that before security arrived because he was the one who found it at 5:42 in the morning, during rounds. The Whitfield dueling pistols, a 19th century pair donated by one of the club's founding families, were gone. Everything else in the display remained untouched. There was a torn strip of yellow contractor's drop cloth caught on the lower hinge. Too obvious, Gus thought, then immediately wrote the thought down as a question instead of a conclusion. Why leave cloth? He photographed the case before touching anything and called Foster. By 7, Derek had an explanation ready. Unfortunate side effect of bringing outside labor onto the property, he said at the staff meeting. The sheriff's office has been notified. Gus stood in the back beside Leon Foundthe and said nothing. A week later, Foster learned, almost by accident, that the sheriff's office had never been asked to process the case. A report number existed. No deputy had been sent to dust the cabinet, interview the overnight crew, or collect the yellow cloth. When Foster told him, Gus added another line to the notebook. He wrote, "Sheriff notified in paperwork only. Under it he added, could be incompetence, do not assign motive." Havoc lay at his feet while he wrote, chin on crossed paws, one amber eye open. That's the problem with you, Gus murmured. The eye remained open. You make staring look like an argument. 11 days later, Dr. Averil's golf bag disappeared from the cart barn during an afternoon tournament. The clubs were worth more than Gus made in several months. There was no forced entry. The barn sat 50 yards from Guardian Crest Materials staging area. Gus had been resetting sprinkler heads nearby. Havoc had been with him. At 2:17 that afternoon, the dog had lifted his head sharply and pulled toward the construction fence. Gus remembered because he had checked his watch automatically. Irritated at first that Havoc had abandoned the patch of shade beneath the cart. At 2:43, the owner discovered his clubs were missing. Coincidence, Gus wrote. Then below it, or movement through staging area at 2:17. He started recording Guardian Crest badge-in times whenever he happened to see the sign-in sheet in the maintenance office. Not secretly, not yet. He simply copied dates that intersected with incidents. The notebook grew slowly. He hated how quickly the pattern began to please the part of his mind that had spent 19 years looking for patterns. That reaction frightened him more than the pattern itself. One night, Foster found him sitting at the cottage table with the green notebook open and Havoc asleep beside his chair. "You've got that look," Foster said. "What look?" "The one where you're arguing with somebody who isn't in the room." Gus closed the notebook. Foster sat opposite him. "Derek?" "Myself." "Who is winning?" "Depends what night you ask." Foster waited. Gus finally turned the notebook around. He had divided 2 pages into 3 columns. What I know, what I think, and what would prove me wrong. Foster read them slowly. "You always do this?" "Used to." "Army?" Gus nodded. "Why the 3rd column?" For a moment, Gus saw Eli Bragg sitting on an ammunition crate under a canvas awning, grinning at him over the terrible instant coffee. Because a man who only records what confirms him isn't gathering intelligence. He's building a religion. Eli had stolen that line from somebody. Gus had never found out who. Keeps a hunch from becoming a fact just because I want it to. Foster looked toward Havoc. And what does the dog think? The dog doesn't think in paperwork. Convenient. Very. The 3rd incident was smaller and therefore, to Gus, more useful. A section of new copper pipe disappeared from Guardian Crest's laydown yard. The contractor filed a loss report large enough to include not only the missing pipe, but associated disruption costs that seemed strangely high for material worth a fraction of the claim. This time, Derek did contact the insurance carrier immediately. He also blamed ongoing site security complications, a phrase that appeared in a staff memo alongside another reminder that Havoc was not to approach the renovation fence. Gus noticed the sequence. He also noticed something else. Every time Havoc showed interest in the West Wing, Roy Pruitt was either on site or had badged in within the previous several hours. He wrote that down. Then he spent half an hour trying to disprove it. Two of Pruitt's badge-ins had no corresponding incident. One incident had occurred on a day Pruitt's badge did not appear at all. Gus circled both facts. Foster, looking over his shoulder, frowned. "Doesn't that hurt your theory?" "Good. Good. If it can't survive being hurt, it's not a theory worth carrying." There were evenings when Gus wondered whether the notebook was an investigation or simply a socially acceptable place to put old fear. Marianne had been good at spotting the difference. During his last years in the Army, when a deployment followed him home in fragments, a vehicle slowing outside the house, a backfiring truck, the wrong smell in a supermarket aisle, she had never told him he was imagining things. She had simply asked the question that returned him to the room. What is happening now? Not what happened then. Now he heard her voice sometimes while he wrote. What is happening now, Gus? Now a contractor had unusual losses. Now Derek dismissed them too quickly. Now Havoc kept reacting to one part of the property. Now none of that proved a crime. That distinction mattered. He owed Eli that much. He owed himself more. The fourth incident was a small electrical fire in a storage closet adjoining the West Wing. The automatic sprinkler system contained it quickly, and the county fire marshal listed the cause as undetermined, consistent with faulty renovation phase wiring. By then, a pattern had started to take shape. Every incident fell within 48 hours of a badge-in by Roy Pruitt, a heavy-set, soft-spoken Guardian Crest supervisor who ran the crew's overnight security detail. And every incident involved either high-value items that could be easily resold or damage that, on paper, justified an insurance claim far larger than the actual loss. The morning after the fire, Gus stood in the scorched storage closet. The sprinklers had left everything within reach damp and gray. He ran his flashlight along a char pattern that struck him, even without formal arson training, as oddly deliberate. It was too contained, too centered on a single junction box, the kind of burn a man might produce on purpose if he understood exactly how much damage he needed and exactly how much he did not. 19 years of after-action reports had taught him that real accidents tended to be messier than this, spreading in directions nobody could fully predict. This fire had behaved, from what little he could reconstruct, with almost surgical restraint, burning exactly enough to justify a substantial claim without ever threatening to spread beyond a single contained, easily replaced closet. Havoc worked the doorway beside him, nose low but not in the rigid pattern Gus associated with a trained explosive search. At the threshold, the dog stopped and drew the air twice, then turned toward the baseboard. Gus smelled it only after kneeling, a faint solvent note beneath wet gypsum and burned wiring, similar to the sharp construction odor that had first caught Havoc's attention at the West Wing fence. Wedged into the seam where new drywall met old was a torn scrap of yellow drop cloth, the same color and weave as the strip left on the pistol case hinge. That still did not make it proof yellow contractor cloth was all over the site. Gus photographed the scrap where it lay, photographed the burn pattern, photographed the threshold, and then wrote two separate entries in the green notebook. Connection, same material, same solvent odor. Alternative, common job site debris. He underlined the second line. Evidence handled badly stopped being evidence. A pattern handled badly stopped being reasoning. He had learned both lessons the expensive way. He brought his log to Foster first. "You think Guardian Crest is running some kind of scheme?" Foster said, turning the pages slowly at his kitchen table that evening, not disbelieving so much as overwhelmed by the specificity of what his brother had assembled. "Stage theft, stage damage, inflate the claims, split the difference with whoever's approving the payouts. I think somebody with badge access and inside knowledge of this property's insurance coverage is running it," Gus said. "I don't know yet if that's just Roy Pruitt or somebody higher up feeding him the targets." Have you told Derek? Derek's the one who hired them over two other bids the board liked better. Gus closed the folder. I'd like to know a little more before I hand a theory to the man who's already looking for a reason to say I imagine things that aren't there. Foster turned the pages back to the beginning, studying the dates again. You realize if you're right about this, it's bigger than just getting your dog kicked off the property. Somebody's defrauding this whole club. Maybe other places too, and Derek either knows about it or he's too incompetent to notice. And I honestly don't know which of those possibilities I find less comforting. Neither do I, Gus said. That's part of why I haven't gone to the board yet. I want to know which one it is before I hand them a folder that could get me fired either way. You already might get fired either way, Foster pointed out. Might as well be right about something while it happens. Gus almost smiled at that, the first real flicker of humor Foster had seen cross his brother's face in weeks. Almost sounds like something Marianne would have said. She'd have said it a lot louder, Foster said, and probably while marching straight into Derek's office to say it to his face instead of sitting here at my kitchen table being careful about it. She was always better at that part than me. Havoc, meanwhile, had developed what Derek referred to dismissively in a second memo after the electrical fire as an unhealthy fixation on construction debris. On 4 separate occasions that month, the dog stopped sharply at the west wing fence, nose working, attention fixed through gaps in the plywood. None of it was a formal explosives alert, and Gus never described it as one. But the intensity unsettled more than one member walking past. Derek used each episode as fresh evidence in his campaign to have the dog removed before the club's insurance carrier, already unhappy about the theft claims, found another reason to flag Cypress Bend as an elevated risk. Gus began, quietly, timing his rounds to pass the west wing perimeter whenever Havoc's body language suggested the dog wanted to, rather than avoiding the site the way Derek's memo implicitly encouraged, reasoning that a dog with Havoc's training didn't develop an unhealthy fixation on anything without a reason a working handler owed it to him to take seriously. In the green notebook, Gus began recording not just the dates Havoc showed unusual interest, but the exact places along the fence where it happened. Otis eventually helped him obtain a rough sketch of the site plan. When Gus cross-referenced the two, the pattern tightened around 2 locations. The service closet that later caught fire, and a section of newly framed interior wall 2 rooms farther in. As far as Gus could tell from outside the fence, that second wall had no reason to contain anything worth a working dog's attention. He would not learn what that second location actually concealed until considerably later. And when he finally did, it would explain rather more than the fire alone ever had. It was Priscilla Vance, the club's longtime gala committee chair, who first connected Gus to help beyond his brother's kitchen table. Priscilla had noticed Gus differently than most members did. After Derek's careless comment about somebody's mutt, she quietly looked into exactly who August Renner was. The phrase had struck her as something said by a man who had formed an opinion before bothering to ask a single question. What she'd found in that year's gala honoree list, his name, his rank, the 2 clipped sentences of a Silver Star citation that undersold by a wide margin exactly what those sentences represented, had stayed with her since, a quiet private embarrassment on behalf of a club she'd given 11 years of unpaid work to. She found him near the equipment barn a few days after the fire, ostensibly to discuss the coming season's fundraiser, and instead stood watching him work for a long moment before she spoke. I chaired this club's Veteran Scholarship Gala for 11 years, she said. I don't miss much that happens on these grounds, Mr. Renner, and I've noticed you've been carrying a folder around like it's evidence in a trial nobody's called yet. I also happen to know a woman who'd find that folder considerably more interesting than I do. Gus's hands stopped moving on the sprinkler head he was repairing. Not sure what you think you've noticed, he said carefully. I've noticed a man who used to move through this property like he was invisible on purpose, start writing things down in a little green notebook every time something goes missing, Priscilla said. Not unkindly, but with the particular steel of a woman who had chaired 11 successful galas by never once accepting the first answer she was given. I've also noticed our new general manager seems considerably more interested in getting rid of your dog than in actually finding out who's been stealing from this club. I find that combination worth paying attention to, Mr. Renner. I'd like to help, if you'll let me. Gus considered her for a long moment, weighing 19 years of instinct about who could be trusted against 6 weeks of watching a memo turn a quiet job into something considerably more precarious. You know a lawyer who takes on cases like this? I know several, Priscilla said. I know exactly one who'd do it because she actually cares whether the truth comes out, rather than because it might look good on a resume. And she introduced him that same week to Colonel Adele Foundthe, retired, a longtime club member who had spent the back half of her Army career in the Judge Advocate General's Corps and now split her time between a small private practice and, in her own words, making sure this club's board doesn't sign anything they haven't actually read. Adele listened to Gus's full account without interrupting once. The particular discipline of someone who had spent 2 decades in courtrooms learning that the fastest way to miss the truth was to start talking before the whole of it was on the table. You understand what you're describing, if you're right, isn't just theft, Adele said finally. It's insurance fraud conducted through a vendor. This club's own general manager personally steered the contract toward over 2 better bids. That's not a coincidence I'd want sitting unexamined, Mr. Renner. I'll help you look at this properly. But I want you to understand before we start pulling threads that a scheme built to look like ordinary bad luck doesn't usually collapse quietly when someone finally notices it. She walked him through what the coming weeks were likely to require, slowly and without false comfort. First, a formal records request had to go through the club's finance office, so nothing could later be characterized as improperly obtained. Second, every incident needed careful documentation, with times and witnesses independent of Gus's notebook wherever possible. Then Adele watched his face and added the last part. A man already unpopular with the club's general manager was about to become considerably more so. I've been called worse by worse people in worse places, Gus said. I think I can manage a man with a clipboard. I believe you, Adele said, and something in her expression suggested she meant it more literally than the pleasantry usually implied. I served 11 years in the Judge Advocate General's Corps before I retired into private practice, Sergeant Renner. I've prosecuted men who thought a uniform made them untouchable and defended a few who genuinely were being railroaded by one. I know which category this feels like to me right now. I just ask you to let me handle the parts of this that involve paperwork and boards threatening lawsuits. And you handle the part that involves a dog with better instincts than most auditors I've worked with. Deal, Gus said, and did not yet know how literally both of them would end up meaning it before the season was through. Adele brought in, within the week, a forensic accountant named Simone Delacroix, a sharp, soft-spoken woman in her 30s who specialized, she explained over coffee in the clubhouse's nearly empty morning dining room, in tracing exactly this kind of scheme. Inflated claims, shell subcontractors, kickback arrangements dressed up as legitimate invoices. She had spent 6 years at a regional accounting firm before leaving to start her own practice, she told Gus, after discovering, on a routine audit, that a client she genuinely liked had been quietly laundering embezzled funds through a children's charity board for the better part of a decade. I didn't sleep right for a month after that, she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. Not because I was scared of what I'd found, because I realized how easy it had been to miss if I hadn't happened to pull the one thread that unraveled it. I decided after that I'd rather spend my career pulling threads on purpose than hoping I stumble onto them by accident. Give me your log and give me access to Guardian Crest's billing records, she told Gus, flipping through his green notebook with visible, professional appreciation for how methodically he'd kept it. And I can tell you within a week whether Roy Pruitt is running this alone or reporting to somebody with a bigger stake in the outcome. Men who run schemes like this almost never do it purely for themselves. There's usually a debt or a boss or both. How do you usually find that out? Gus asked. Same way you found your pattern, Simone said. Patience, and refusing to accept the first innocent explanation somebody offers you. Most fraud doesn't get caught because it's clever. It gets caught because somebody finally got bored enough, or angry enough, or grieving enough to keep looking after everyone else stopped. She glanced at him, not unkindly. I'd guess you know something about that last one. Gus didn't answer directly, but something in his expression must have confirmed it, because Simone didn't push the observation any further and simply turned back to the notebook, already sketching, in the margin of her own legal pad, the first rough outline of the paper trail she intended to follow. The club's longtime membership records clerk was an elderly, meticulous man named Otis Beauregard. He had worked at Cypress Bend for 34 years and remembered, without needing to check, exactly which board members had favored which contractor bid. He listened to Gus's careful explanation with the patience of a man who had spent 3.5 decades being asked small favors by people who rarely explained why they mattered. "You're not the first person to come to me quietly asking about that renovation bid," Otis said, leading Gus back through a narrow archive room, lined floor to ceiling, with filing boxes labeled in a neat, decades-consistent hand. "Board split on it 6-5, closer than anything this club's voted on in years I can remember. The two members who fought hardest against Guardian Crest both happened to resign from the board within a month of losing that vote. I always found that a touch too tidy for my own taste, but nobody asked my opinion, and it isn't really my place to offer it uninvited." Otis pulled the original renovation proposals from a box marked with the year in faded ink and laid them across a reading table. He handled them with the reverence of a man who considered old paperwork more valuable than most people did. Tucked inside Guardian Crest's bid packet was a subcontractor disclosure listing Thibodeau Claims Consulting as a risk assessment partner. It occupied only 3 lines and a footnote. Most board members had probably never read past the attractive headline number. Otis had a habit, Gus noticed over the following weeks of working alongside him in the narrow archive room, of narrating small pieces of the club's history as he searched unprompted, as though the paperwork itself deserved the courtesy of context before being disturbed. "People think an archive is where an institution keeps what it remembers," Otis told him once, sliding a box back onto a shelf. "Mostly it's where an institution keeps what it would rather not talk about. Same paper, different intention." The sentence stayed with Gus. He had spent years doing something similar inside himself. Filing away Eli, filing away Marianne, filing away every warning that arrived too late to matter, and every memory that still felt too sharp to hold in daylight. He had always thought silence was the same as control. Otis's room suggested another possibility. Silence could also be storage, and stored things had a way of waiting. "This box here is from the year they finally let women serve on the board," he said at one point, tapping a carton 3 shelves up without looking at it. "Took 11 years of petitions before that happened. Half the petitions are filed right beside the meeting minutes that rejected them, if you ever want to see how long some things take to change around here." Gus found himself, more than once, genuinely absorbed in these small digressions, despite the urgency of what they were actually searching for, and understood, watching the old man move through decades of paper with such evident affection, that Otis Beauregard had likely been waiting a very long time for someone to actually want to hear any of it. "That name mean anything to you?" Otis asked. It didn't, not yet, but Simone confirmed within days that Thibodeau Claims Consulting was owned through the same network controlled by Guardian Crest's founder, Marcus Thibodeau. That meant the people profiting from the renovation were also positioned to profit from preparing risk assessments, repair scopes, and remediation work tied to losses generated on the same job. Otis received the news with the quiet, satisfied nod of a man who had suspected something rotten in that footnote for months and had simply never had anyone with reason enough to ask. 34 years I've filed this county's paperwork for this club," Otis told Gus once the connection was confirmed, "and I've watched more than one clever man assume that meant nobody was actually reading it. I'd be obliged, Mr. Renner, if you'd let me keep helping. It's been a good while since anybody around here needed anything from this archive beyond a member's forgotten anniversary date." "That's not a coincidence either," Adele said, when the 4 of them, Gus, Foster, Adele, and Simone, sat around Foster's kitchen table the following evening, the folder now considerably thicker than the one Gus had first brought there alone. "That's a closed loop. Guardian Crest creates the damage, a related consulting arm documents the loss and repair scope, and money can move through both sides of the same broken window." Leon Foundthe, the groundskeeper who'd worked the fairways alongside Gus for 4 years and had, without ever being formally asked, started covering Gus's early morning rounds so his friend could spend more hours on the growing investigation, leaned against the kitchen doorway with a mug of coffee he'd helped himself to and shook his head slowly. "Y'all realize," Leon said in the mild, unhurried drawl that made most of his observations sound like jokes even when they weren't, The man running this operation is the same man your fancy new manager handpicked over 2 other bids. And that same manager is the one trying hardest to get Gus and his dog thrown off this property before anybody starts asking why. Nobody at the table disagreed with him. Lan had grown up 3 parishes over, the youngest of 6 brothers, and had a gift, honed over a lifetime of family dinners nobody could ever quite finish arguing through, for saying the thing everyone else in the room was carefully avoiding saying out loud. He had covered Gus's morning rounds without being asked. When Gus tried to thank him, Leon waved it off. Man loses his wife and keeps showing up to mow my fairways every single morning for a year and a half without complaint. Least I can do is giving him a couple hours to go be useful at something that actually matters. He had no formal role in what followed beyond driving, watching, and saying the occasional uncomfortable truth out loud. But every person at that kitchen table understood, without needing it stated plainly, that the investigation would have moved considerably slower without him quietly absorbing the parts of Gus's job nobody else had offered to cover. They worked through most of that evening. Foster refilled coffee mugs long after the pot had gone bitter. Simone cross-referenced Guardian Crest badge logs against Gus's green notebook, entry by entry, on a laptop propped against the sugar bowl. Adele drafted the formal steps that would have to happen before anything they had assembled could be presented somewhere it might actually matter. It was well past midnight before Adele finally closed her notebook and looked around the table at the unlikely group that had assembled itself around one groundskeeper's green notebook. I want to be honest with all of you, she said. What we have right now is a strong theory, not proof. Proof is going to require access we don't currently have, cooperation from people who have no reason to give it to us, and probably more time than any of us would like. I'd understand if some of you decided this wasn't worth the trouble it's about to cause. Nobody at the table moved to leave. The escalation, when it came, did not come from Roy Pruitt or from Guardian Crest directly. It came from Derek Ashcombe 3 days after Simone Delacroix quietly requested copies of Guardian Crest's original billing records through the club's finance office. A request that, Gus would later understand, reached Derek's desk for approval within hours, and, from there, very likely reached Marcus Thibodeau by that same evening. By then, Derek had spent 6 weeks growing steadily more anxious beneath his composed exterior. The strain was visible only to people paying close attention. Priscilla noticed first. She told Adele that the new manager had begun double-checking his office locks every evening, an odd habit for a man who claimed to have nothing to hide. What none of them yet knew would surface weeks later in Simone's financial trail. Derek Ashcombe owed a considerable sum to a private lender connected, through several layers, to Marcus Thibodeau. The debt came from increasingly desperate sports bets placed the previous winter. At first almost by accident, and later with grim deliberateness, Derek had gone from an overconfident manager making bad decisions to a man with a genuine reason to make sure nobody looked too closely at Guardian Crest's books. Gus arrived at the maintenance shed the following morning, coffee still in hand, Havoc trotting ahead of him toward the golf cart the way he did every single morning, without variation, to find 2 county sheriff's deputies waiting for him alongside Derek, who held his clipboard the way a man holds a shield. Foster was already there too, standing off to one side with his arms crossed and an expression Gus recognized instantly as his brother's specific brand of controlled fury, the kind that had once, decades earlier, gotten Foster suspended from high school for defending Gus against 3 boys twice his size. "What's this about?" Gus said, setting his coffee down slowly on the tailgate of his truck, every motion deliberate, the particular calm he'd trained into himself for exactly this kind of moment. The moment when panic would cost more than it could ever buy back. "Mr. Renner," Derek said, with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had finally been vindicated after weeks of being quietly undermined. "These officers are here regarding the theft of the Whitfield pistols and Dr. Averil's golf bag. Security logs show your grounds card badge accessed the West Wing perimeter within the relevant time window on both occasions. Several members have also reported your dog repeatedly fixating on the construction site. Earlier this morning, after an anonymous tip, club security entered your staff cottage under the emergency access clause in the housing agreement. They opened the drawer identified by the caller, found this, stopped the search, and called the sheriff." He held up in a clear evidence bag one of the missing antique dueling pistols. Gus stood very still, the particular stillness Foster recognized from 19 years of watching his brother absorbed bad news without letting it show on his face, and understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with panic, exactly what had happened and roughly how long it must have taken someone with badge access and motive to plan it. He had left the cottage unlocked more nights than not in 4.5 years. Before Derek Ashcombe arrived, the biggest security concern had been the occasional errant golf ball. There had never been a reason to lock up. Now the realization of how easy he had made it for someone to walk in and leave something behind sat in his stomach like a stone. "When was the cottage entered?" he asked, keeping his voice level with an effort that cost him more than anyone watching could have guessed. "This morning," Derek said, "before you arrived." "Who went inside?" "Club security. Without me, without my brother, based on an anonymous tip nobody's bothered to identify." Gus looked at the older of the two deputies, a heavy-set man in his 50s who appeared almost as uncomfortable with the situation as Gus felt. "Were you here before anyone opened that drawer?" The deputy shook his head. "We were called after the item was found." That answer mattered. So did the chain of custody it immediately put into question. "I didn't take that pistol," Gus said. "And I didn't call in an anonymous tip on myself." "That's for the investigation to determine," Derek said, though something in his voice suggested he had already determined it to his own satisfaction. "Effective immediately, you're suspended from duty and barred from club grounds beyond the staff cottage lot pending the outcome. Your dog is confined to the cottage as well. I'll remind you that this club has been extraordinarily patient with an animal our own insurance carrier has flagged as a liability 3 separate times this month." Havoc sensed the shift before language caught up to it. He pressed hard against Gus's leg and made a low sound in his chest that was not quite a growl. One deputy, unfamiliar with the toy, took a half step back and let his hand drift toward his belt. The motion stopped the instant Gus's hand found the top of Havoc's head. Havoc sat, calm and still. "Easy," Gus said, low both to the dog and, in a way, to the deputy too, the same steadying tone he'd once used on nervous young handlers standing too close to live ordnance for the first time. "He's not going anywhere he isn't told to. Neither am I." The younger of the two deputies, visibly uncomfortable with the whole scene, cleared his throat and addressed Gus directly for the first time. "Sir, I need you to understand this isn't personal. We just go where the evidence points us." "I understand exactly how that works," Gus said. "Spent 19 years learning it can point the wrong way just as easy as the right one if somebody wants it badly enough." "He's not a threat," Gus said quietly to the deputy, and then, more quietly, mostly to himself, "Neither am I, but I understand how this looks." "Where did the tip come from?" Gus asked, before either deputy could move him along. "Anonymous," Derek said. "Called into the club's front desk last night. A concerned member, I'm told, who preferred not to give a name." "Convenient," Gus said. "A concerned member who happened to know exactly which drawer in my cottage to mention." Something flickered behind Derek's eyes, there and gone, the specific irritation of a man who had not expected the accused to notice the detail that mattered most. "I wasn't aware the tip specified a drawer, Mr. Renner. I'd be careful what you volunteer in front of two deputies." Gus said nothing further. Over 19 years, Gus had learned that the most useful thing a man could do when cornered by someone who wanted a reaction was refuse to give one. He held that discipline now with everything he had left. In his own driveway, an evidence bag hung between them containing a pistol he had genuinely never touched in his life. He was escorted off the working grounds that afternoon with Havoc walking calm and close at his side. A small cluster of staff stopped working to watch. Priscilla Vance stood frozen near the clubhouse steps with one hand pressed to her mouth. Foster argued, low and furious, with a board member who kept repeating that the board simply had no choice given what security had found. Leon Foundthe, watching from the equipment barn doorway with a rake still in his hand, called out that this was the stupidest thing he'd seen this club do in 4 years working there, loud enough that Derek glanced back once, jaw tight, and said nothing in reply. Priscilla Vance caught up to him at his truck door, having crossed the entire parking lot at a pace considerably faster than her usual measured stride. "This is absurd," she said, low and furious. 11 years I've chaired committees at this club, and I have never once seen a suspension handled this fast or this sloppily. I'm calling an emergency board session myself if I have to." "Don't burn your standing on this yet," Gus told her, more gently than he felt. You'll do more good staying inside the room than getting yourself labeled a problem right alongside me. Priscilla did not look entirely convinced, but she nodded once and squeezed his arm before turning back toward the clubhouse with the particular determined stride of a woman already composing in her head the exact language of the memo she intended to send every board member by that evening. Adele Foundthe met him in the parking lot next before he'd even reached his truck. "This is not a coincidence either," she said without preamble. "Somebody learned Simone requested those billing records and moved within 72 hours to make sure the person who'd assembled the paper trail against them was too discredited to be believed by the time anyone actually read it. I want you to understand something clearly, Sergeant Renner, because I don't think you're currently in a state of mind to hear it as anything but another loss. This is not the end of this. This is proof we were close enough to something real that somebody panicked." "Doesn't feel like proof," Gus said. "Feels like I just lost the only job I've had since Marianne died. Over a pistol I've never touched. Because of a dog everybody already wanted an excuse to get rid of." "I know," Adele said. "I'm not going to pretend that part isn't real. But I've spent 8 years as a prosecutor and 14 as a defense counsel. And I've learned that people only frame a man this fast and this sloppily when the truth is close enough to hurt them. Give me a week. Give Simone a week. Don't do anything that gives Derek Ashcombe a second excuse to say you can't be trusted." She was as good as her word. Within 2 days, Adele had filed a formal demand with the board that the anonymous tip's call log be preserved and reviewed by an outside party, a demand the board reluctantly granted only after Priscilla Vance, in her own words later, made it considerably more uncomfortable to refuse than to agree. The club's front desk log showed the call came from a prepaid phone number used once and never again. It had been purchased with cash at a gas station 11 miles from the club. That told Adele little about who made the call, but it told her something else with clarity. Whoever made it understood exactly how to avoid being traced. Within the week, Simone confirmed that Roy Pruitt's crew had logged unusual overtime on the same night the pistol was apparently planted in Gus's cottage. The hours were billed to Guardian Crest's general maintenance account, rather than any specific renovation task. Simone explained why that mattered. Vague internal billing made convenient cover if a supervisor needed a crew member somewhere off the books for an hour without anyone asking where. Otis Beauregard, meanwhile, was doing something none of the others had thought to do, because none of the others had 34 years of institutional memory to draw on. On the second day of Gus's suspension, Otis let himself into the records room after the front office closed. He used a key the club had technically asked him to surrender when he retired 3 years earlier. As he later told Simone, he had simply forgotten to hand it over, same as I forget most things the club would rather I remember to do. He spent 4 hours working backward through 40 years of renovation contracts. Vendor names were cross-referenced against insurance claim numbers using a system that existed nowhere on any computer. It lived only in the geography of Otis's memory and a set of handwritten index cards he had maintained since the late 1990s. What he found and brought to Simone's kitchen table the following morning in a cardboard banker's box that had not been opened in over 2 decades was a renovation project from 1994. A resurfacing of the men's locker room contracted to a firm called Gulf Parish Restorations. A similar pattern had played out. Items were reported stolen during construction. An insurance claim was filed and paid. A supervisor left the firm's employ abruptly 6 months later and was never publicly connected to anything. Most significantly, the claim approval carried the signature of Preston Castellan, a finance committee member at the time, and Harmon Castellan's father. Otis was careful not to call that proof of wrongdoing. He called it a reason to keep reading. "I'm not saying the board chairman is involved in whatever's happening now," Otis told Simone carefully, laying the yellow documents out across her kitchen table with the reverence of a man handling something he considered genuinely sacred. "I'm saying this club's had this exact kind of trouble sniffed out and quietly buried once before 30-some years ago, and the man whose name is on the paperwork that made it go away raised the man who's currently choosing not to ask very many questions about Guardian Crest's billing practices. Might mean nothing, might mean everything. But I thought you'd want to know the club's got a history of this, not just a habit." Simone spent most of that night photographing every page in the box. Her kitchen table gradually disappeared beneath 1994 invoices, insurance correspondence, and board minutes. In places, the language looked eerily familiar, the same vague references to unrecoverable items, the same unusually fast insurance settlement, the same absence of follow-up once the check cleared. She did not yet have proof of a direct line between 1994 and the present, and she was careful when she called Adele that night not to overstate what 30-year-old paperwork could actually establish in a courtroom. But she also could not stop looking. By 1 in the morning, at the two claim numbers side by side, separated by 3 decades and strikingly, almost lazily, similar in structure, as though whoever had designed the current scheme had simply dusted off a template that had already worked once and never been questioned. "It doesn't prove Harmon Castellan knows anything about what's happening now," Adele said carefully, when Simone read her the relevant passages over the phone well past midnight. "But it tells us something else useful. It tells us this club has a documented history of preferring a quiet insurance settlement to an uncomfortable public question. Whoever set up Guardian Crest's arrangement may have been counting on that same preference holding true one more time." Gus did not entirely keep his promise to Adele. He spent the next several days technically obeying the letter of his suspension, remaining on the staff cottage lot or leaving by the service road, never entering the working grounds and having no contact with staff on club property. While Havoc grew steadily more restless, Foster had quietly secured 1 week before the board's final decision on the cottage came down. The dog paced the porch each evening, ears tracking sounds from the direction of the club a half-mile off, refusing to settle fully even on quiet nights. The same restless vigilance Gus remembered from the weeks before a mission everyone else insisted was routine. "I hear you," Gus told him more than once, sitting on the porch steps in the dark with the useless compass turning slowly in his fingers. "I don't like it either, but I gave my word." He spent those days in a strange, suspended version of the life he'd built since Marianne's death. No fairways to mow, no bunkers to rake, hours that had always been structured by physical work, now stretching out flat and shapeless in front of him the way they had in the worst months right after the funeral. Foster brought groceries twice that week without being asked and stayed longer than the errand required both times. Sitting on the porch steps beside his brother in a silence that did more good, Gus suspected, than either of them would have known how to say out loud. Denise sent a covered plate that Sunday, the same as always. For the first time in 18 months, Gus remembered to return the dish the very next morning. Some stubborn part of him needed to prove, if only to himself, that he could still hold on to small rituals while everything larger around him felt like it was coming apart. He thought often in those restless evenings about the last time he had felt this specific combination of certainty and powerlessness. Not the grief of Marianne's illness, which had been a different kind of helpless entirely, but the particular fury of watching a decision get made by someone with authority and no information, overruling a man who had both. He had felt it standing in a briefing tent 7 years earlier, watching an officer wave off his read on a route because a timetable mattered more that day than a sergeant's instinct he couldn't fully document. He felt it now, sitting on a porch step in Louisiana, watching a general manager wave off 6 weeks of documented pattern because a pistol in an evidence bag was easier to believe than a groundskeeper's green notebook. He did not tell Adele about that particular parallel. Some things he had learned lost something essential in the telling, and he preferred to carry this one the way he carried most things, quietly at the center of himself, where only Havoc ever seemed to notice its weight shifting. Adele called twice during those 3 days with careful, incremental updates. None felt quite large enough to count as progress, but none was nothing. The tip's call log had been preserved. Simone's badge analysis was nearly complete, and a sympathetic board member privately admitted that the suspension had moved too fast, though he was not yet willing to say so publicly. "I know it doesn't feel like much," she told him on the second call. "I promise you it's more than it sounds like over the phone." Gus believed her. He also, in the particular way of a man whose training had never fully trusted anything he couldn't personally verify, kept walking the tree line along the outer edge of the cottage lot each evening, close enough to see the West Wing's construction lights glowing faintly through the trees without crossing back onto the working grounds. Havoc stayed restless and alert beside him the entire time. It was Leon Foundthe who brought the news that finally broke Gus's promise to stay away. He arrived at the cottage well past midnight, 3 days into the suspension, driving the back road with his headlights off until the last bend. By the time he came through the porch, he was breathing hard. Not from the walk, but from the effort of deciding how much of what he had seen was fear and how much was fact. Havoc was already on his feet. West Wing's got a setup crew working overnight, Leon said. Tomorrow's Veterans Gala, 400 guests, Lieutenant Governor. Derek moved the event into the renovated side because he says the old ballroom doesn't fit the club's new direction. Gus stood. Leon kept going. I saw Pruitt's people in the service corridor 3 hours ago. They were working on the temporary gas line. No inspector, no maintenance ticket on Foster's board. Then they all left at once. What kind of work? Couldn't see enough to tell you, but I watched one of them carry a pipe wrench in and bring it back out clean. Gus looked toward the dark line of trees beyond the cottage. The West Wing sat half a mile away, invisible from the porch except for a faint glow above the branches. You tell Adele. Called. She told me to call the fire marshal if I had an active leak and to call her back if I had anything more than a bad feeling. Fair. I don't have anything more. Havoc moved to the porch steps and stared toward the club. Leon saw it. He's been doing that all night? 3 nights. Gus, I know. No, I mean I know what you're thinking, and I'm saying it before you can. You're suspended. You cross that property line tonight. Derek gets exactly what he wants. Gus went inside. For 1 second, Leon thought the argument had worked. Then Gus came back carrying the green notebook, a flashlight, work gloves, and the battered compass that had been in his jacket pocket for 4 years. He sat on the edge of the porch and pulled on his boots. If I'm wrong, I lose a bump I may already have lost. And if you're right, Gus looked at Havoc, then tomorrow night 400 people stand in a room next to a gas system somebody touched after midnight without an inspection. That still doesn't mean sabotage. No. The answer came quickly enough to surprise Leon. It doesn't. Gus tightened the second boot. That's why I'm not going in there to prove sabotage. I'm going in there to answer one question. What question? Is it safe? Leon stared at him. Gus's voice stayed quiet. 7 years ago, I turned a warning into an argument because nobody would listen. I've spent 7 years believing the only mistake was that I didn't push harder. I'm not making the opposite mistake now. I don't need to be right about Pruitt. I don't need to be right about Derek. I need to know whether that building is safe. Leon picked up his keys. Then I'm driving. They parked short of the club's security lights and approached on foot. The air had cooled enough that every small sound carried. Gravel under their boots, insects in the drainage ditch, the distant compressor cycling behind the maintenance building. Cypress Bend, stripped of members and carts and daytime voices, felt less like a country club than a collection of dark structures pretending not to know one another. Havoc moved at Gus's left side. Leon had seen the dog every day for 4 years. He had watched children put paper hats on him. He had watched him sleep through leaf blowers and thunder. He had never seen this version. The loose retirement trot was gone. Havoc's head was lower, his movement economical, his attention moving through the dark in measured slices. Different dog, Leon whispered. No, Gus said. Same dog. That answer stayed with Leon. They reached the plywood fence. The gap Leon used during daylight to move debris had been screwed shut. That wasn't like that yesterday. Gus touched one of the screws. Fresh metal, bright edges. Another way? South corner. They circled. Havoc stopped before they reached it. Not a trained set, not a formal indication. He simply planted his feet and refused the next step. Gus crouched. What? The dog turned his head toward the building and drew air through his nose. Once. Twice. Then he looked back at Gus. Marianne's question came into Gus's mind with almost painful clarity. What is happening now? Not 7 years ago, not at the board meeting, not in Derek's office. Now. Gus smelled damp soil, fresh lumber, adhesive, cut grass, nothing else. Easy, he murmured. They moved another 20 yards. This time Gus caught it. Faint, sulfurous. Not the sweet smell memory had supplied in dreams, not the burned metal scent of Afghanistan. Something more ordinary and therefore more dangerous in a Louisiana building. The odorant added to fuel gas precisely so human beings would know it was where it should not be. Leon caught it a moment later. Tell me that's not, back up. Havoc had already turned. That mattered to Gus. The dog was not pulling them toward the source. He was trying to create distance. Gus followed for 2 steps, then glanced back toward the wall, and almost without deciding, shifted 1 foot forward again. Havoc moved faster. His teeth closed on the loose fabric at Gus's sleeve, and he hauled backward with enough force to rip a line of stitching at the cuff. Not an attack, not panic, a correction. Gus stopped. For 1 second, he stared at the torn sleeve. Then he let Havoc pull him another step away. They retreated until the smell thinned. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The old version of Gus, or perhaps only the version he had accused himself of being, would have gone closer. He could feel that impulse as clearly as if another man stood beside him, whispering instructions. Find the joint. Find the proof. Make it undeniable. Do not let them dismiss you again. Eli Bragg's voice arrived with it, not as memory exactly, but as texture, calm over a radio, professional, even when Gus knew he was uneasy. Route looks open, Sarge. 20 minutes after Gus had warned the rotor was wrong. A schedule had won. A man had died. For years, Gus had carried one conclusion from that day. Push harder next time. Standing outside Cypress Bend's west wing with gas in the air, another conclusion finally became possible. The problem had never been that Gus failed to be forceful enough. The problem had been that people had valued being on time more than being uncertain. If Gus walked deeper into a gas-filled building because he needed proof before he called for help, he would be doing his own version of the same thing, valuing certainty more than safety. Havoc pressed his shoulder into Gus's knee. Gus put one hand on the dog's neck. I hear you. He backed away another 10 paces. Then he called 911. He did not say sabotage. He did not say insurance fraud. He gave the dispatcher exactly what he knew. Active odor of gas at a commercial renovation site, uninspected overnight work, a major event scheduled for the following evening, and a suspected leak inside a concealed wall. The dispatcher told him to remain clear. We are. Do not re-enter the building. We won't. Leon looked at him after the call ended. You just saved me the trouble of tackling you. Wouldn't have worked. Let me keep believing it would have. They waited at the far side of the service road. Sirens remained off when the first fire marshal's vehicle entered the service road. Gus appreciated the restraint. No spectacle, no reason to draw sleeping staff or curious members toward a possible gas leak. A county deputy followed, then a utility emergency crew. The deputy recognized Gus. His expression tightened. You're not supposed to be on club property. No, CJ. That's going to become my problem tonight. After you check the gas. The deputy looked at Leon. Leon pointed toward the west wing. Smell it yourself from 30 yards. The fire marshal did not need 30. His handheld detector began responding near the outer fence. Everything changed after that. The service area was cleared. The gas supply was isolated. The building's electrical circuits were shut down from outside. A second crew arrived with intrinsically safe lights and meters. Gus remained where he was told. That, more than anything, surprised Leon. Havoc lay at his boots, awake. Once the utility crew declared the outer service road safe, Havoc lifted his head and turned toward a pallet of discarded drywall inside the cleared area. He moved only a few steps before stopping at a crumpled strip of yellow drop cloth caught beneath the pallet. Leon exhaled. Same stuff. Gus stayed behind the line the fire marshal had given him. Photograph it from there. Leon did. Even at a distance, Gus recognized the cloth used by Pruitt's overnight crew. When an investigator later bagged it, the same sharp solvent odor was obvious. Across 6 weeks, every place where Havoc had shown unusual interest had involved one of two things: the West Wing service corridor or that yellow contractor cloth. That did not mean Havoc had been detecting stolen property. It did not mean he had somehow smelled fraud. It meant one odor had been moving through several places the fraud touched. 40 minutes later, the fire marshal came back outside. You were right about the leak. Gus felt no satisfaction. Accidental? We don't know yet. How bad? Bad enough that tomorrow's event is not happening in that wing. Leon sat down on the bumper of the truck. The marshal continued. Joint behind a newly finished section of wall, loose enough to leak, not loose enough to make noise. Could be bad workmanship. Could be. The marshal studied Gus. You don't sound convinced. I don't need to be. That answer made the man look at him differently. Gus held out the green notebook. There's a section of wall 2 rooms west that my dog has been interested in since construction started. I'm not asking you to open it because of the dog. I'm asking you to compare it to the plan before your people leave. Wait till I am. Because the framing changed after the plans were approved. That detail had come from Otis's copy of the original bid drawings, something Gus had noticed but never known what to do with. A shallow utility chase had become a full-depth partition without a documented change order. The marshal took the notebook. You have plans? Copies in my truck. It took another hour. Once the gas had been cleared and the area declared safe for inspection, investigators removed a section of drywall from the altered partition. Inside was not a dramatic vault, no stacks of money, no bomb, just a cavity built between studs, deeper than the plans required, containing carefully wrapped property. The missing Whitfield dueling pistols, Dr. Averill's golf clubs, disassembled. Silver serving pieces from another club theft that had never been publicly connected to Cypress Bend. Electronics with inventory stickers from a hotel renovation 2 parishes away. Every bundle was wrapped in the same yellow contractor cloth. The same solvent odor hung inside the cavity. Havoc, outside the perimeter, never saw any of it. He did not need to. That's what he smelled, Leon said quietly. Part of it. You knew? No. Gus looked at the dog. I finally stopped pretending I did. State investigators arrived before dawn. By 6, the West Wing had become a crime scene. By 7, Roy Pruitt's phone was off. By 9, Guardian Crest's office had hired counsel. The gala was relocated to the original ballroom. Priscilla Vance managed the change with such ferocious competence that most guests arriving that evening knew only that renovation complications had forced a last-minute shift. Remember, the lieutenant governor's security detail knew more. So did the board. The story broke publicly 2 days later. By the weekend, a local paper had reduced the whole complicated night to a photograph of Gus beside Havoc and a description of them as the veteran and the dog who saved the gala. Gus disliked the simplification almost as much as Foster enjoyed clipping the article and leaving it on his kitchen table. Roy Pruitt was arrested at a highway motel 2 counties away. He had a one-way ticket booked under a false name and enough cash to suggest he had not intended to return. Once confronted with the concealed property, the badge records, the gas line tampering, and Simone Delacroix's preliminary financial analysis, Pruitt stopped protecting the people above him. His statement confirmed the broad shape Gus's notebook had never been able to prove alone. Guardian Crest had used renovation projects to create controlled losses. Valuable items disappeared during construction. Minor damage generated inflated claims. Thibodeau Claims Consulting, tied to the same ownership network, prepared loss assessments and remediation scopes that supported those claims. Money then moved through subcontractors and security remediation invoices until the original theft looked like only one small piece of the profit. The gas line had been an escalation. Pruitt told investigators that after Simone's records request reached the club, Marcus Thibodeau wanted the West Wing problem turned into one large, apparently accidental loss. The plan was for an overnight fire before gala guests arrived, destroying the concealed cash and much of the renovation trail while generating the largest claim yet. Pruitt insisted nobody was supposed to be in the wing when it happened. Investigators pointed out that setup crews had already been working there and that a leaking gas line did not come with a clock. The distinction offered very little comfort. Derek Ashcombe had steered Cypress Bend toward Guardian Crest while carrying gambling debt tied to a lender connected to Marcus Thibodeau. He had not invented the entire scheme. That almost made Gus dislike him more. Derek had entered it gradually, one compromise at a time, a favorable contract recommendation, an ignored discrepancy, a claim approved too quickly, a payment accepted because he had already told himself he would stop after this one. By the time Gus began asking questions, Derek was no longer protecting a contractor. He was protecting the version of himself he still needed to believe was temporary. The anonymous tip had been his idea. Planting one of the stolen pistols in Gus's cottage had been Pruitt's. The goal had not been to send Gus to prison. It had been simpler. Make him unreliable. Make every future accusation sound like retaliation from a disgruntled employee with an aggressive dog and a grievance against management. That part bothered Gus more than the frame itself. Not because it was clever, because it had almost worked. The emergency board meeting began 48 hours after Pruitt's arrest. Gus did not want to attend. Adele insisted. "You don't have to defend yourself," she told him. "The evidence does that now." "Then why am I there?" "Because the board owes you the discomfort of saying what they did while looking at you." So Gus went. He wore the same work boots he had worn when security escorted him out. Havoc came too, not as a symbol, because the board had formally lifted the exclusion pending the meeting. And because Gus had no interest in leaving his partner outside so a room full of people could feel more comfortable discussing him. Derek sat at the far end of the table with an attorney. He looked smaller than Gus remembered. Not physically. Certainty had been doing more work for the man than anyone had noticed. Adele laid out the sequence without theatrics. The Guardian Crest bid, the claim pattern, the badge records, the anonymous phone, the planted pistol, the gas line, Pruitt's statement, Simone's tracing of the payments. Nobody mentioned Gus's silver star until Priscilla, asked to explain how she had first begun questioning Derek's treatment of him, referred to the gala honoree list. Several board members turned toward Gus. He disliked the change in their faces immediately. Recognition, embarrassment, respect arriving late because paperwork had supplied a rank. Gus shifted in his chair. "Can I say something?" Harmon Castellan, the board chairman, nodded. Gus looked around the table. "I appreciate what Priscilla's trying to explain. But if the lesson this board takes from this is that Derek should have treated me differently because I have a silver star, then you've learned the wrong lesson." Nobody moved. Gus continued. "You shouldn't need a medal in a drawer before you ask a groundskeeper why his dog keeps stopping at the same wall. You shouldn't need 19 years in the Army before a notebook gets read. And you shouldn't need a man to turn out impressive before it becomes embarrassing that you dismissed him." Derek looked down. Gus did not look at him. "I was wrong about parts of this. I thought Pruitt was present at every incident. He wasn't. I thought Havoc might be reacting to one thing behind that wall. It turned out he was reacting to an odor moving through several things. I wrote down every fact that hurt my own theory, because being believed isn't the same as being right." He rested one hand on Havoc's shoulder. "This dog didn't solve an insurance fraud case. He noticed something I kept trying to explain away. Other people solved the parts they were trained to solve. Foster noticed the reporting gaps. Simone followed the money. Adele kept the evidence usable. Otis kept records everybody else forgot. Leon came to my door when he saw something dangerous." His voice roughened slightly. "The failure wasn't that nobody recognized a hero. The failure was that everybody had a small piece, and most of us had been taught, for one reason or another, to keep it to ourselves." The room stayed quiet. For once, Gus did not feel trapped by the quiet. He had said what he came to say. Havoc lay down beneath the table. Derek's attorney began explaining that his client had acted under substantial pressure and had initially believed Guardian Crest practices to be legitimate. Gus stopped listening. Outside the boardroom windows, a grounds crew cart moved across the 9th fairway. Work continuing. Ordinary life, indifferent to revelation. For years, Gus had believed closure would feel like a door slamming. Instead, it felt like realizing the door had been open, and he no longer needed to stand in it. Derek's attorney spoke for less than 10 minutes before Harmon Castellan stopped him. "Counsel," the chairman said, "I understand pressure. I understand debt. I understand bad judgment compounding itself until a man convinces himself he no longer has choices. None of that explains why Mr. Ashcombe chose to manufacture evidence against an employee who was asking inconvenient questions." Derek finally looked up. For the first time since Gus had known him, there was no clipboard in front of him. "I didn't know about the gas line, but the TNN," he said. Adele's expression did not change. "That may matter to a prosecutor." "I mean it." "I'm sure you do." Derek looked toward Gus. "I never wanted anyone hurt." Gus believed him. That was the difficult part. Derek probably had not wanted anybody hurt. He had wanted his debt contained, his job protected, the renovation finished, the questions postponed. Harm had entered the plan as a cost someone else would absorb later. Gus had seen that kind of thinking before in rooms where nobody considered himself cruel. Eli Bragg had died inside one. "Wanting isn't the same as stopping," Gus said. Derek flinched. It was the only thing Gus said directly to him. The board terminated Derek that afternoon. Within a week, his cooperation agreement with state investigators was being negotiated. Months later, his testimony helped connect Guardian Crest and Thibodeau Claims Consulting to similar staged loss schemes at 3 other properties. Marcus Thibodeau fought the case. Men with money often had the luxury of making consequences arrive slowly. His lawyers challenged records, disputed witness credibility, attacked Pruitt's motives, and described the overlapping ownership of the renovation company and claims consultancy as legal corporate structuring rather than evidence of fraud. Simone Delacroix kept working. She was not dramatic about it. That was why Gus trusted her. She built spreadsheets nobody outside an investigation team would ever want to read, traced invoice numbers through shell subcontractors, matched claimed replacement costs to actual purchases, and found the kind of small, repeated errors that schemes accumulated when the people running them began to believe repetition was the same thing as safety. 2 years later, Thibodeau accepted a plea rather than take the full case to trial. Gus heard about it from Adele over the phone while repairing a sprinkler head near the 5th green. "Thought you'd want to know," she said. "Appreciate it." "That's all?" Gus tightened the valve. "What am I supposed to do, dance?" "I'd pay to see it." "Then definitely not." She laughed. After the call, he went back to work. That surprised him too. There had been a time when he imagined accountability would lift something enormous out of him. Instead, the news arrived, mattered, and then made room for the rest of the afternoon. Maybe that was healthier. The board reversed Gus's suspension unanimously and removed every reference to it from his personnel file. They also offered him compensation for the days he had missed. He accepted the back pay and refused everything else. Priscilla asked why. "Because I want them to fix what happened, not buy the feeling that they fixed me." She nodded slowly. "Marianne would have liked you. Marianne would have terrified you." Priscilla smiled. "Even better." Havoc's status created a longer argument. The insurer still had language excluding certain working breeds. The board could not simply pretend the policy did not exist now that the dog had become popular. Gus refused to let Havoc become a ceremonial exception based on hero worship. "If the rule's wrong, fix the rule," he told them. "Don't write my dog's name into bad policy and call that progress." That forced a conversation nobody at Cypress Bend had expected to have. The insurer reviewed Havoc's veterinary records, temperament history, training documentation. In 4.5 years without an incident. The club adopted a behavior-based animal policy rather than a blanket breed category. Havoc qualified easily. Months later, Priscilla told Gus the board had spent more time debating that insurance language than it had spent approving Guardian Crest's original contract. "That seems backwards." "It is," she said, "which is why I made them put the new review process in the bylaws too." Future renovation bids over a fixed threshold would require an independent conflict of interest review. Insurance claims above a modest amount would require external verification. Vendor relationships had to be disclosed in full, including common ownership through consulting affiliates. Otis Beauregard attended the vote. Afterward, he found Gus outside the pro shop. "Institutions aren't good at apologizing," the old records clerk said. "They mostly prefer amendments." "Does an amendment count?" "If the next person doesn't have to fight the same fight, I generally count it." Gus thought about that. "Fair." Otis held out a slim archival box. Inside were copies of the 1994 records he had uncovered during the investigation. The earlier renovation claim, the quiet settlement, Preston Castellan's signature. "I made a complete index," he said. "Not because it proves the old bush was the same as the new one. It doesn't. Adele made me promise to say that every time I talk about it." She would. "But it proves something happened and nobody asked enough questions. That's worth keeping where somebody can find it." Gus looked at the box. "Why give it to me?" "I'm not. I'm showing you before I put it back." Otis smiled faintly. "Some things belong in the archive. They just shouldn't be buried there." That distinction stayed with Gus. Harmon Castellan sought him out several months later. The chairman chose a Tuesday morning when the clubhouse was nearly empty. Havoc sat beside Gus near the maintenance office, while Castellan stood with the stiffness of a man unused to conversations he could not manage through procedure. I looked into my father's involvement in the 1994 matter, he said. Gus waited. What I found was not criminal, as far as I can establish. It was also not honorable. Castellan looked toward the fairway. He signed a settlement he had reason to question, because asking more would have embarrassed people he knew socially. He chose quiet. Gus felt the word more than he heard it. Castellan continued. I spent most of my life believing quiet institutions were stable institutions. I think I confused the absence of noise with the presence of integrity. Gus looked down at Havoc. Easy mistake. Too easy. Castellan faced him again. I owe you an apology. You already reversed the suspension. That's procedure. So? I said apology. Gus almost smiled. Then say it. Castellan did. No board minutes, no audience, no language softened by counsel. He apologized for allowing an accusation to move faster than scrutiny, for treating Gus's silence as weakness and Derek's certainty as competence, and for participating in a culture where the person easiest to inconvenience had also been the easiest to doubt. Gus listened. A year earlier, he might have needed the words. Now he simply appreciated them. Thank you. Castellan exhaled as if he had expected something harder. Havoc looked up at him once and then rested his chin on his paws. Dog doesn't think much of ceremony, does he? Mostly wants to know if you're carrying food. Castellan laughed. It was the first time Gus had heard him do it. Priscilla's idea for the scholarship came later. She arrived at the cottage one Saturday with a folder under one arm, and the expression Foster had learned to recognize as evidence she had already decided something on behalf of several other people. I want to add a permanent scholarship to the Veterans Program. Gus kept sanding the handle of a garden tool. Okay, named for Eli Bragg. The sandpaper stopped. Havoc lifted his head. Priscilla did not rush to fill the silence. That was one reason Gus had grown to like her. How do you know his name? You said it once at the board meeting. Adele told me enough to understand I should ask you before doing anything else. Gus looked toward the tree line. What kind of scholarship? Trade school, certification programs, something practical, for veterans or reservists trying to build a civilian life and who don't necessarily fit the picture people have in their heads when they hear the word scholarship. Eli would have loved that. The thought arrived so quickly Gus had to look down. Bragg had been the man on the team who could make a radio work after 3 other men swore it was dead, who fixed a generator using parts he had no business having in his pocket, who believed every complicated machine could be reduced to one simple question. What stopped doing what it was supposed to do? He would have hated having his name on something. Priscilla smiled. Most worthwhile people do. He would have made jokes through the whole ceremony. Then we'll keep the ceremony short. Gus ran his thumb along the broken compass in his pocket. The needle still pointed uselessly toward a fixed angle. He gave me this. Priscilla waited. It was the first time Gus had volunteered a story about Eli without being asked. He bought it at a surplus shop because I got us lost on a training exercise once. You? One time. Hope he enjoyed that. For years. Gus smiled despite himself. Priscilla saw it and wisely did not comment. He told me it was so I'd always know which way home was. Did it work? Gus looked at the stuck needle. Not especially. The first Master Sergeant Eli Bragg Memorial Scholarship went to a 19-year-old Army reservist named Tyler Camo, who was studying HVAC repair 2 counties over. That last detail would have kept Eli supplied with jokes for a month. Gus attended the presentation lunch. Foster had to remind him to iron his shirt. You own an iron, Foster said. Technically. You own a shirt that isn't green. Debatable. Havoc was not allowed in the dining room during the meal and slept outside the veranda doors in a patch of sun, visible through the glass. Gus sat near the back. When Tyler found him afterward, the young man held the scholarship certificate with both hands. Sir, I wanted to ask about Master Sergeant Bragg. Gus nearly gave the answer he had used for 7 years. Good man, hell of a soldier. Would have hated the fuss. Instead, he looked through the glass at Havoc sleeping outside. He was terrible at cards, Gus said. Tyler blinked. Sir? Could not bluff. Thought he could. Couldn't. The young man smiled uncertainly. He sang badly, fixed everything, talked too much when he was nervous, and even more when everybody else was. He could make a 19-year-old private feel like screwing up wasn't the end of the world, which is harder than it sounds. Gus kept talking. Not about the ambush. Not yet. About Eli. The difference mattered. 10 minutes became 20. When Tyler finally left, Foster was standing near the coffee urn, pretending not to have listened. Not a word. I didn't say anything. Your face did. What did my face say? Something real sentimental. Gus pointed toward the door. Go away. Foster laughed. That spring, Gus drove 2 states over to see Eli's parents. He had almost gone dozens of times. After the funeral, he had made it as far as the interstate once and turned around. After Marianne died, the trip became one more thing he promised himself he would do when breathing felt easier. Breathing had never volunteered a date, so he picked one. Havoc rode in the passenger seat. Eli's mother opened the door before Gus reached the porch, recognized him from photographs, and hugged him without asking permission. Gus stood rigid for half a second. Then his arms came up. Eli's father was quieter. He shook Gus's hand with both of his and held on longer than a handshake required. They sat at the kitchen table for most of the afternoon. For the first hour, Gus told the safe stories. The cards, the singing, the broken generator, the compass. Then Eli's father asked the question Gus had feared for 7 years. Did he know? Gus understood immediately. Before the ambush, did Eli know the route was bad? Gus looked down at his hands. Yes. Eli's mother closed her eyes. I warned against it. Command overruled. Eli knew I disagreed. Was he scared? She asked. Gus could have lied gently. He did not. He was alert. That's not what I asked. No, ma'am. Gus breathed once. He was scared enough to pay attention. Not scared enough to stop doing his job. Her eyes filled. Gus continued because stopping now would be another form of hiding. I spent 7 years thinking I failed him because I didn't make them listen. I thought if I'd argued harder, embarrassed somebody, refused the route, Eli's father interrupted. Would they have changed it? Gus looked up. I don't know. Then you don't know that you could have saved him. I was responsible for him. You loved him. The word landed harder than responsible ever had. Eli's father leaned back. Those aren't the same thing, Sergeant. Gus had no answer. For 7 years, he had arranged the memory, so duty carried all the weight. Duty was easier. Duty had procedures. Duty could be failed. Love was less useful. Love could remain even when there was nothing left to correct. Eli's mother reached across the table and touched the battered compass lying beside his hand. He gave you that? Yes, ma'am. He bought 3 of them. Gus stared. She laughed through tears. He gave one to his father because he said your whole team had no sense of direction. Eli's father shook his head. Mine still works. For the first time all afternoon, Gus laughed. It came out rough and surprised. Eli's mother laughed too. The sound did not betray grief. It made room inside it. Before Gus left, Eli's father walked him to the truck. You gonna fix that compass? Gus looked at it. Been broken 4 years. Didn't answer me. Gus slipped it into his pocket. I'll think about it. Eli's father nodded. That's usually where fixing starts. Bragg's mother cried again when Gus left, briefly and without apology, and thanked him for bringing her a version of her son that did not end on a road in Afghanistan. The drive home took 6 hours. Havoc slept across the passenger seat for most of it, waking only when Gus stopped for gas, and once when rain began striking the windshield hard enough to sound like gravel. Gus kept the compass in the cup holder. At a red light outside Baton Rouge, he picked it up, turned it in his palm, and watched the dead needle refuse north. For years, he had liked it broken. He had never admitted that to himself. A working compass suggested there was a correct direction, and a man could fail to take it. A broken one asked nothing. It could be carried without being trusted. So could grief. 2 weeks later, Gus took the compass to a small repair shop in town run by a man who worked mostly on watches, barometers, and old survey instruments. The owner turned it over beneath a magnifying lens. Sentimental? Something like that. Might not be worth the repair. It isn't. The man looked up. Gus nodded toward the compass. Repair it anyway. When he picked it up 3 days later, the needle moved freely for the first time in 4 years. North was suddenly ordinary again. That surprised him. He had expected the repaired compass to feel like an answer. It did not. It was simply a tool that could point north. Home, Gus was beginning to understand, had never been a direction. By the following winter, Cypress Bend had settled into a version of normal that would have looked almost identical from the road. Fairways still needed mowing. Members still complained about tee times. Priscilla still ran meetings as if delay were a personal insult. Otis still appeared in the archive room often enough that nobody seriously believed he was retired. Leon continued telling the story of the midnight return with increasing dishonesty. By Christmas, his version included a high-speed chase. There was no chase, Gus told him. Not with that attitude. You drove 12 miles an hour with the lights off. Boy, stealth chase? That's not a thing. It is now. Foster laughed hard enough to set down his coffee. Gus did too. The first time Foster heard that full laugh after Marianne's death, he stepped outside the equipment barn and stood alone for several minutes. His wife Denise found him there later. You okay? Yeah. You look like you're crying. Allergies. In December? Very aggressive pollen. She waited. Foster rubbed both hands over his face. He laughed. Now Denise understood. Oh, I forgot what it sounded like. That was all he could say. Gus did not become outgoing. He did not transform into a man who enjoyed speeches or crowded rooms or being described as inspirational. He remained the person who arrived before dawn and preferred a broken sprinkler to a committee. But he stopped disappearing quite so efficiently. When a young groundskeeper named Mateo struggled with an irrigation controller nobody had shown him how to use, Gus sat beside him for 40 minutes instead of fixing it in 5. When a caddy asked whether Afghanistan had been frightening, Gus did not answer with a joke and walk away. Sometimes, he said. The boy waited. Gus added, most things worth respecting are. It was not a story, but it was more than he would have given a year earlier. At Foster's house that Christmas, his niece Caroline asked whether Havoc had really found a bomb. Wasn't a bomb, Gus said. What was it? Gas leak. Deliberate. Worse? In some ways. She sat cross-legged on the floor, scratching Havoc's gray muzzle. But you found it. Havoc noticed the problem before I did. He always does that? No, Foundthe. Caroline looked surprised. Gus smiled. That's the important part. What is? He's a dog, very well-trained dog. Better nose than anybody in this family. Still a dog. Foster raised his beer. Thank God somebody finally said it. Gus ignored him. Havoc didn't know about insurance fraud. He didn't know Derek was lying. He noticed odors and behavior in places that didn't fit what he'd learned was normal. Then people had to do the rest. Caroline thought about that. So everybody saying he solved the whole case is wrong? Mostly. Havoc's tail thumped. He doesn't seem offended. He has healthy self-esteem. Caroline smiled, then became serious. Uncle Gus? Yeah. Is that why you got so quiet after the army? The room changed. Foster looked down at his drink. Denise became very interested in a plate on the table. Caroline, realizing too late that she might have crossed a line, started to apologize. Gus stopped her. No, to him. She waited. He looked at Havoc, then toward the dark window beyond which Cypress Bend's fairways disappeared into the winter night. Partly. What was the other part? He could have said Marianne. Everybody in the room knew Marianne. Instead, he said, for a long time I thought being careful meant keeping things to myself until I could prove them. Then somebody I cared about died after I warned about something I couldn't prove. After that, I thought the lesson was the opposite. Say it louder. Make people listen. Well, Caroline listened without moving. Turns out both can go wrong. What do you do instead? Gus considered the question. You say what you know. You say what you don't know. You listen when somebody else knows a piece you don't. And if the stakes are high enough, you make the safe choice before you make the certain one. Caroline looked down at Havoc. Did he teach you that? Helped. Havoc sighed in his sleep. Foster later told Denise it was the longest thing he had heard his brother say about the army in years. Gus did not know that. He was outside by then, walking Havoc back toward the cottage. The dog was slowing, not dramatically. Age rarely announced itself dramatically at first. Havoc took longer to stand after sleeping. On cold mornings, he stretched his rear legs before climbing into the cart. The scar above his left eye looked more pronounced as the black mask around it turned gray. Gus noticed every change. Of course he did. For several months, he responded the way he had responded to Marianne's diagnosis in its earliest weeks, by turning love into arithmetic. 12-year-old Belgian Malinois, 13, 14, average lifespan, working dog joints, veterinary markers, autumns remaining. He hated himself every time he calculated and did it again anyway. One evening, the veterinarian finished Havoc's exam and found Gus staring at the chart. "He's doing well." "How well?" The veterinarian leaned against the counter. "That's not a medical question." Gus looked up. "You want me to tell you how much time?" "Yes." "I can't." Gus nodded. He had known that before asking. The veterinarian rested a hand on Havoc's back. "What I can tell you is he's comfortable. He's interested in food. He wants to work more than his joints want him to. He still knows exactly where you are every second he's in this room." Havoc looked at Gus as if on cue. The veterinarian smiled. "You're trying to prepare." "Yes." "For losing him." Gus said nothing. "You know preparation won't make you love him less when it happens." "No, happy." "Then don't spend the good days rehearsing the bad one." Marianne could have said it. Maybe that was why Gus remembered. He stopped doing the arithmetic as often. Not completely. He was still Gus. But when the calculations came, he redirected himself toward whatever was actually in front of him. A dog asleep in the cart. A tree line at sunset. A morning cold enough to see Havoc's breath. A porch step warmed by a late afternoon sun. "What is happening now?" Marianne's question. Now Havoc was here. That had to be enough. The following October, Gus visited Marianne's grave with Havoc. He brought no flowers this time. Just the repaired compass. He sat in the grass. Havoc lowered himself beside him with a soft grunt. For several minutes, Gus said nothing. Then he placed the compass on the flat stone at the base of the marker. "Fixed it." The needle settled north. "You would have told me to do it 4 years ago." Wind moved through the cemetery trees. "You would have liked Priscilla." Havoc's ears flicked. "No, that's a lie. You two would have fought constantly." He smiled. "Would have liked each other after." He told Marianne about Tyler. About Eli's parents. About Foster pretending allergies had made him cry. About Caroline asking questions nobody else dared ask. About Havoc's hips. About the new kid on the grounds crew who could not read an irrigation schematic and refused to admit it. He told her ordinary things. That was new. For a long time, his visits had been reports from the land of damage. What still hurt, what he missed, what he could not forgive himself for surviving. Now the stories included jokes, annoyances, people. Tomorrow. He stayed until the sun dropped low. When he stood, Havoc needed a second attempt to rise. Gus waited. No reaching down too quickly. No turning assistance into panic. Havoc got his feet beneath him and leaned against Gus's leg. "Yeah," Gus said. The dog remained there. Gus looked down at the compass. It pointed north. The cottage was east. Foster's house was south. Eli's parents lived 6 hours away in a direction Gus could not name without checking a map. Marianne was beneath the grass at his feet. Havoc was beside him. Home had never been a direction. It was the collection of places where a man was known accurately. Not admired, not forgiven for things he had never done. Known. Eli had known him when he was a sergeant who carried too much of responsibility. Marianne had known him when he came home and did not know how to be home. Foster knew when silence meant peace and when it meant danger. Havoc knew without needing language at all. And slowly, against every instinct that had once told Gus to make himself smaller, other people were beginning to know him too. Not because of the silver star, not because a newspaper had called him a hero, because he had finally stopped treating being seen like another kind of exposure. The green notebook remained in the top drawer of his desk. Beside it sat the torn half of the resignation letter he had never finished. He kept that too. Not as a trophy, as evidence. There had been a week when surrender had looked like the most reasonable option available to him. Reasonable did not always mean right. On the first page of a new notebook, he wrote 3 headings: what I know, what I think, and what would prove me wrong. Then after a moment, he added a 4th. Who else might know something I don't? He stared at it. Havoc, asleep beneath the desk, shifted one paw. Yeah, I guess it'd be. All said, that one took me long enough. He closed the notebook. Outside, a sprinkler clicked on near the ninth fairway. Somewhere in the clubhouse, a door slammed. Foster called his name from the maintenance shed. Havoc lifted his head. Gus stood. There was work to do. Maybe there is a fence line in your own life that everyone else has learned to walk past without asking what is really behind it. Gus Renner's healing did not come from a board reversing a suspension. It did not come from Derek Ashcombe being exposed, Marcus Thibodeau taking a plea, or people finally discovering a medal in an old file. It came in smaller decisions. When he wrote down what might prove him wrong, when he backed away from danger instead of moving closer just to be believed, when he told Eli's parents the truth, when he let a young man hear the funny stories, when he repaired a compass that had been easier to carry broken, and when he understood that listening was never the same thing as obedience, silence was never the same thing as peace, and being uncertain did not make a warning worthless. Sometimes loyalty is a dog refusing to leave a wall alone. Sometimes courage is the man beside him admitting he does not yet know why. If this story moved you, subscribe to Silent Ranks K9 for more stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and the quiet moments when someone finally chooses to listen. And tell us in the comments, have you ever known something was wrong before you could prove it? And what did you do when nobody else could see it yet?